picture this. You're embroidering silk threads in colors that cost more than most families earn in a year, completely unaware that in 12 hours, your fingers will be too broken to hold a needle. Your name is Igarim, and you've never questioned why the merchants who visit your father's compound sometimes arrive with haunted eyes and speak in whispers about the lands beyond the eastern mountains. The morning sun catches the turquoise tiles of Samarkand's great mosque as you work beside the fountain in your family's courtyard. The silk beneath your fingers depicts peacocks and flowering vines destined for Damascus markets, where wealthy women will wear your craftsmanship without ever knowing your name. At 17, your world extends from the workshop, where you've spent every morning since childhood, to the women's quarters where you sleep beside your 15-year-old sister Gulnar. Your father, Rashid, controls the silk trade route between Bukhara and Baghdad. His caravans carry more than merchandise. They transport letters between scholars, rare manuscripts, and mathematical innovations that flow like water through the veins of civilization. You've grown up hearing fragments of conversation in Arabic, Persian, and Chinese, languages that drift through the compound like exotic perfumes. The Khwarezmian princess is considering our proposal, your father tells your mother as they walk past your workspace. They're discussing your marriage to a merchant's son in Isfahan, arrangements that will expand trade connections and secure your family's prosperity for another generation. The negotiations have continued for months, conducted through messengers who carry silk samples along with dowry offers. Gulnar hums as she sorts threads by colour, a Persian melody learned from travelling musicians who perform during the spring festivals. Her voice carries the particular confidence that comes from never having witnessed violence more serious than occasional arguments between competing merchants. Neither of you has seen a weapon drawn in anger or heard the sound of approaching armies. The first disruption comes during the midday meal. A caravan master named Yusuf arrives 3 days ahead of schedule, his usual 40-wagon train reduced to 6 vehicles with canvas covers that bulge oddly, as if concealing unusual cargo. His horses are lathered with sweat despite the moderate temperature, and his guards keep glancing toward the eastern gates as if expecting pursuit. The trade routes are unstable, Yusuf tells your father as they negotiate prices for silk shipments. His hands shake as he examines fabric samples, fingers moving with the restless energy of someone fighting to maintain normal routines while carrying terrible knowledge. Perhaps it would be wise to delay large shipments until conditions improve. Your father's response reveals the merchant mindset that has built his fortune. Temporary disruptions create opportunities for those willing to accept calculated risks. What specific problems concern you? Yusuf's answer comes in fragments over the following hour, pieces of information that don't quite form a complete picture. Caravans disappearing without trace, cities that stop responding to trade messages, refugee columns moving westward with possessions that suggest hasty departure from comfortable circumstances, reports of horsemen who fight unlike any known army, moving faster than messengers and leaving destruction that defies traditional military logic. They don't follow the rules of civilized warfare, Yusuf says, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. They don't negotiate terms or honor surrenders or distinguish between combatants and civilians. They harvest people like grain. The phrase sends ice through your veins, though you don't yet understand why. Your father dismisses such talk as the exaggerations that grow around distant events, stories that become more dramatic with each retelling. Samarkand has survived for 8 centuries behind walls that have never been breached by foreign armies. That evening, as you prepare for sleep, you notice details that should have seemed insignificant. The unusual number of merchant families visiting relatives in distant cities, the way conversations stop when you enter rooms, your mother's increased attention to prayer schedules, and her recent interest in learning routes through the mountain passes south of the city. Gulnar falls asleep easily, but you lie awake, listening to sounds that suddenly seem different. The night watchman's calls carry a tension that wasn't there a week ago. Dogs bark more frequently, responding to movements beyond the city walls that might once have been dismissed as normal caravan traffic. Near dawn, you hear something that makes your blood stop moving, the distant sound of hoofbeats, not the familiar rhythm of merchant caravans or the measured pace of city guards, but something that sounds like continuous thunder rolling across the earth. The sound grows steadily louder, suggesting numbers that strain imagination. You slip to the window and peer through the latticed screen toward the eastern horizon. What you see there will haunt your dreams for the rest of your life. A dark line stretching across the landscape, like a storm front, but moving with purpose and coordination that no natural phenomenon could achieve. The line resolves into individual shapes as it draws closer, thousands upon thousands of horsemen advancing in formations that seem to flow like water while maintaining perfect military precision. The realization hits you with physical force. Your father's confidence in Samarkand's walls was misplaced. These riders aren't coming to negotiate or demand tribute. They're coming to harvest. The walls that protected your city for 800 years crumble in 3 days, but the real horror begins after the fighting stops. You're huddled in the grain cellar beneath your father's warehouse with 37 other women, listening to systematic sounds above that suggest organized activity rather than chaotic looting. Heavy boots move across the wooden floors in patterns too regular for random searching. Voices call to each other in a language you don't recognize, but their tone suggests coordination and planning rather than the excitement of spontaneous violence. Someone is taking inventory of the building's contents, including its human occupants. The cellar's wooden door splinters inward with a crash that makes everyone scream. Torchlight floods the space, blinding you after hours of darkness. Rough hands drag you and the other women into the courtyard, where your father once hosted poetry competitions and merchant negotiations. The familiar space has been transformed into something that resembles a livestock market. Women from across the neighborhood stand in loose groups, their clothes torn and faces streaked with tears, but alive and apparently unharmed in ways that suggest careful selection rather than random capture. You search desperately for familiar faces and spot your neighbor's daughter Zara, the silk merchant's wife Fatima, and dozens of others whose presence confirms a pattern you don't want to acknowledge. Mongol warriors move among the women with measuring tools and writing materials, conducting evaluations with the business-like efficiency of grain inspectors or horse traders. They examine teeth, feel for muscle tone, and record details in ledgers that reduce human beings to livestock inventories. The process reveals planning and preparation that goes far beyond anything resembling battlefield chaos. Age 17, unmarked skin, good teeth, evidence of adequate nutrition. An administrator dictates to a scribe while examining you with hands that feel clinical rather than aggressive. His Turkic accent suggests he's a local man who has already submitted to Mongol authority, now serving as an interpreter and facilitator for procedures he understands intimately. The sorting process divides women into 3 distinct groups. Those over 40 are led away behind the mosque, and the screams that follow last only minutes before ending in silence that feels heavier than the sound of violence. Girls under 12 are loaded onto carts with specialized restraints, their destinations unspoken but clear from the way mothers collapse at the sight. You and Gulnar find yourselves in the middle category, with women between roughly 14 and 30 years old. This group receives different treatment, better food, medical attention for injuries, and careful monitoring that suggests plans extending beyond immediate use. The administrative precision reveals months or years of experience managing similar operations. The psychological warfare embedded in these procedures becomes clear as you're forced to watch fathers executed in front of their daughters. The killings aren't quick military executions, but deliberately prolonged demonstrations designed to maximize emotional trauma. Each death is calculated to destroy specific relationships and eliminate particular forms of potential resistance. Mongol commanders move among their troops with handheld signals, coordinating the timing of different activities to create maximum psychological impact. They've learned that terrorized populations submit more completely than grateful ones, and they've developed techniques for producing terror that operate with scientific precision. As evening approaches, you're chained to 43 other young women in a wagon specifically designed for human transport. The interior modifications reveal uncomfortable truths about the systematic nature of these operations. Ventilation holes, sized for human breathing, waste drainage systems, iron loops for securing human cargo during long journeys, and storage compartments for the supplies necessary to keep valuable prisoners alive during extended travel. The wagon's construction suggests months of planning and preparation. Someone studied the optimal conditions for transporting women across vast distances while maintaining their health and market value. The engineering solutions reveal calculation and forethought that transform individual tragedies into industrial processes. Through gaps between the wooden slats, you watch Samarkand burning with fires that follow no random pattern. Specific buildings blaze while others remain untouched, suggesting selective destruction designed to eliminate symbols of your previous culture while preserving infrastructure useful for new occupants. The flames consume libraries, schools, and religious centers while leaving granaries, workshops, and administrative buildings intact. Gulnar hasn't spoken since the initial capture, responding to your whispered reassurances only with mechanical nods that suggest her mind has retreated to places where current reality cannot reach. Her silence reflects a psychological withdrawal you recognize in roughly half the women around you, a defensive shutdown that may represent the mind's attempt to preserve itself during conditions that exceed normal coping capacity. The wagon lurches into motion just after midnight, beginning a journey toward destinations that exist in administrative records but remain unknown to the human cargo being transported there. The systematic nature of these procedures suggests operations that extend far beyond your city, patterns of conquest and processing that operate across continents and involve coordination between military units, administrative personnel, and logistical networks that span the known world. As Samarkand's lights disappear behind you, the last thing you see is a line of similar wagons stretching into the distance, each carrying its own cargo of systematic human tragedy. The sight confirms what you've begun to understand. You're not victims of random violence, but components in a machine designed to transform people into commodities through processes that operate with the efficiency of industrial agriculture. The journey to Karakoram takes 6 weeks, and by the 3rd day, you understand why the wagon was designed with drainage systems underneath each sleeping area. Women die regularly during transport, not from violence, but from diseases that spread through close quarters, exhaustion that overwhelms weakened bodies, and something the guards call soul sickness, the condition where prisoners simply stop eating and drinking until their hearts give up. Each morning begins with the same routine. Guards unlock the wagon's rear gate and drag out bodies that didn't survive the night. They check each corpse for valuable items before tossing them into roadside ditches like spoiled grain. A scribe records each death in leather-bound ledgers, noting the deceased woman's estimated age, condition at time of capture, and probable cause of death. The bureaucratic precision transforms human tragedy into accounting procedures. You learn to recognize the signs that precede death in your fellow captives. First comes the vacant stare, eyes that focus on nothing and respond to nothing. Then the cessation of tears, not because grief has ended, but because the body no longer has moisture to spare for emotional expression. Finally, breathing becomes shallow and distant, as if the person is already halfway to wherever the dead go. Gulnar shows all 3 signs by the end of the 1st week. She hasn't spoken since leaving Samarkand, hasn't eaten the bread portions you saved for her, and responds to your desperate whispers only with the mechanical nods of someone whose mind has traveled to places where current reality cannot follow. You realize with growing panic that she's choosing to die, and nothing you say or do seems capable of calling her back. The wagon stops at predetermined locations along the route, settlements where Mongol administrative stations have been established to manage the logistics of continental conquest. At these stops, guards trade worn-out horses for fresh mounts, replenish water supplies, and sometimes exchange human cargo for different prisoners deemed more suitable for specific destinations. During one such stop, you witness an exchange that reveals the scope of the system you've become part of. A group of Chinese women, apparently captured during the siege of Zhongdu, are traded for several of your wagon mates in a transaction that treats people like interchangeable commodities. The Chinese women appear to have traveled for months, their clothes replaced by standard grey garments that mark them as processed prisoners rather than recent captives. The trade negotiations include discussions about the relative value of different types of women. Chinese captives command higher prices because of skills in silk production and mathematics. Persian women are valued for beauty and artistic abilities. Turkic women bring middle-range prices but are considered more adaptable to different climates and working conditions. At night, pressed against other women in the suffocating wagon, you hear fragments of stories from across the growing empire. A Khwarezmian princess describes watching her infant son killed because his crying annoyed a Mongol commander during a diplomatic meeting. A merchant's daughter from Urgench recounts systematic procedures designed not for immediate gratification, but to establish ownership through pregnancy and psychological dependence. The stories reveal patterns that extend far beyond individual cruelty. The Mongols have developed standardized methods for breaking cultural identity, techniques that operate with the efficiency of industrial processes. They've learned which psychological pressures produce compliance, which physical conditions maintain reproductive capacity, and which administrative procedures prevent the formation of resistance networks among captive populations. One story haunts you more than the others. A woman named Bibi describes the fate of her home city after conquest. The Mongols didn't simply loot and depart, they established permanent administrative centers staffed by local collaborators who understood both cultures. These administrators implemented taxation systems that extracted not just wealth but people. Every household was required to provide quotas of young women and children, delivered on schedules that prevented communities from hiding or protecting their most vulnerable members. The systematic nature of these quotas reveals planning that extends across generations. The Mongols aren't just conquering territory, they're reshaping entire populations through controlled breeding programs that will produce future generations loyal to Mongol interests rather than their ancestral cultures. When your wagon finally reaches Karakorum, you understand why the journey's survivors were kept alive despite the obvious expense and logistical challenges. The city isn't just a political capital. It's the administrative heart of a system that processes human beings with the same efficiency applied to any other resource extraction operation. Specialized facilities occupy different districts of the city, each designed for managing specific categories of captives. Military compounds house boys being trained for Mongol armies. Administrative centers process older men with useful skills. Commercial districts include slave markets, with established pricing structures that fluctuate based on supply and demand from across 3 continents. You're assigned to a compound specifically designed for housing women of reproductive age. The architecture reveals uncomfortable truths about the systematic nature of these operations. Individual cells are sized for single occupancy, but include features that suggest long-term habitation stone sleeping platforms, small storage niches, and waste systems connected to sophisticated drainage networks. The compound's central courtyard provides space for monitored exercise, with sightlines that allow guards to observe all activities from elevated positions. Medical facilities occupy an entire wing, equipped not for treating diseases, but for managing pregnancies, monitoring reproductive cycles, and ensuring that valuable human assets remain capable of fulfilling their intended functions. The compound's administrator approaches you during the intake process. Wei Ling is a Chinese eunuch whose perfect Persian suggests years of experience managing multicultural populations. His manner combines bureaucratic efficiency with the detached kindness of someone who has learned to maintain psychological distance from the human suffering he administers. Your assignment is to Commander Subutai's household, he explains, while recording details about your background and physical condition. Your cooperation ensures adequate food, medical care, and protection from unnecessary hardship. Resistance ensures suffering that serves no purpose beyond your own destruction. His words carry the weight of countless similar conversations. This isn't a threat delivered in anger, but information provided by someone who has witnessed the consequences of cooperation and resistance, often enough to speak from statistical rather than emotional knowledge. That first night, lying on a straw mattress in a cell barely larger than your father's storage closet, you finally understand why the women in the wagon spoke of death as a mercy. The true horror isn't what they plan to do to your body. It's how systematically they've designed every detail to destroy your identity while preserving your biological capacity to produce children for an empire built on the systematic exploitation of conquered peoples. 3 months later, you've learned to split yourself into 2 different people, the obedient breeding animal that the Mongols see, and the hidden self that preserves fragments of who you were before they reduced you to reproductive function. The daily schedule reveals the industrial precision with which the empire manages its human resources, and every hour is designed to maximize both physical productivity and psychological control. Dawn begins with mandatory exercises in the compound's central courtyard. The routine was developed by Chinese physicians who studied optimal conditions for pregnancy and childbirth, then perverted to serve conquest rather than medicine. You perform stretches and breathing techniques that would normally promote health and well-being, but now feel like maintaining livestock in peak condition for breeding purposes. Wei Ling observes these sessions from his elevated office, recording notes about each woman's physical condition, compliance with instructions, and signs of psychological resistance. His detailed charts track menstrual cycles, dietary intake, sleep patterns, and social interactions with the methodical attention that other administrators might apply to crop yields or livestock production. The data feeds into reports that travel throughout the Mongol Empire, creating a network that manages human breeding like agricultural planning. Regional commanders receive updates about the reproductive capacity of their assigned women, projected birth rates, and recommendations for optimizing population control across conquered territories. The psychological manipulation proves more sophisticated than the physical restraints. During the intake process, you were told that Samarkand had been completely destroyed and all its inhabitants killed. Fabricated evidence supports this claim. Blood-stained clothing, allegedly belonging to your parents, official documents declaring your family extinct, and testimonies from other prisoners who claim to have witnessed the massacre. The goal is eliminating hope of rescue or return, making resistance seem pointless, while encouraging psychological dependence on Mongol systems for basic survival. Women who believe their previous lives have been entirely erased become more compliant and less likely to attempt escape or organize resistance activities. But the administrators didn't anticipate how shared trauma creates its own forms of solidarity. In whispered conversations between cells, during brief moments of contact in exercise areas, women share techniques for psychological survival that spread through the population like beneficial diseases. Gulnar begins speaking again during the 2nd month, but only in the ancient Sogdian dialect your grandmother used for prayers and private conversations. She's created a linguistic refuge that guards can't understand, a small space of mental freedom within a system designed to eliminate such possibilities. Her choice of language becomes a form of resistance that operates below the surface of apparent compliance. The compound houses women from dozens of conquered cities, creating an involuntary sisterhood bound by shared experience rather than cultural similarity. Persian poets share verses with Chinese mathematicians. Turkic singers teach melodies to Arab scholars' daughters. Knowledge that the Mongols assumed they had destroyed survives in these underground exchanges. Some women develop elaborate mental exercises that allow psychological escape during the systematic violence that Mongol law defines as legitimate reproduction. They describe techniques for separating consciousness from physical experience, visiting imaginary places constructed from memories of their destroyed homes. Others discover methods for inducing miscarriages using herbs gathered during supervised work details in the compound's gardens. The knowledge spreads carefully, shared only among women whose desperation outweighs the severe punishments that discovery would bring. A few learn to deliberately scar themselves in ways that reduce their value as breeding stock without causing obvious disability. Small cuts in strategic locations heal into marks that suggest disease or genetic flaws, making pregnancy less likely to be assigned to their particular cases. But the system adapts to every form of resistance. Guards are rotated frequently to prevent emotional attachments that might lead to lenient treatment. Women who show signs of rebellion face transfer to labor camps where survival rates approach zero. The Mongols have learned through experience that terrorized compliance produces better long-term results than direct brutality. The compound's medical facilities reveal the true scope of systematic planning. Physicians, employed by the empire, maintain detailed records of each woman's reproductive history, tracking pregnancies, births, infant survival rates, and the long-term health effects of controlled breeding. The data contributes to research aimed at maximizing the efficiency of human resource extraction. These medical records survive in Chinese archives, documenting procedures that treated women like experimental subjects rather than patients. Physicians develop techniques for increasing pregnancy rates, reducing maternal mortality during childbirth, and managing the psychological conditions that sometimes prevented successful reproduction. The research includes studies of optimal nutrition for pregnant captives, architectural designs that promote psychological compliance, and administrative procedures that prevent the formation of resistance networks among prison populations. The empire approached human exploitation with the same systematic methodology applied to military engineering or agricultural planning. Your assigned commander, Subutai, visits the compound monthly to inspect his human property and select women for immediate use. These inspections follow standardized procedures that evaluate physical condition, psychological compliance, and reproductive potential. Women are presented in lineups that resemble livestock auctions more than human interactions. Subutai's manner during these inspections combines casual indifference with practical assessment. He examines teeth, feels for muscle tone, and asks questions about menstrual regularity with the detached interest of someone evaluating horses or cattle. His queries about your background focus on genetic factors that might influence the quality of potential offspring. The legal framework supporting these procedures appears in Mongol administrative codes that survive in archives across Asia. Imperial law defined captured women as legitimate spoils of war, subject to ownership by individual commanders or collective assignment to military units. The regulations include detailed procedures for establishing ownership, transferring property rights, and managing the children born from systematic rape. These laws weren't aberrations or violations of legal standards. They were the official legal framework that governed conquest and population management across the empire. The systematic nature of the exploitation was enshrined in legal doctrine that treated human beings as resources to be extracted and managed rather than people deserving protection. During your 4th month in the compound, you discover something that transforms your understanding of the entire system. While working in the administrative offices as a translator, you gain access to correspondence between regional governors about problems arising from their population management strategies. The letters reveal that the Mongol approach to conquered peoples contains fundamental contradictions. An empire built on systematically traumatizing populations creates enemies faster than it can eliminate them. The techniques that seemed effective in the short term produce long-term consequences that threaten imperial stability. Survivors of Mongol conquest carry cultural memories that resist erasure across generations. Children born in breeding compounds preserve elements of their mother's cultures despite systematic efforts to eliminate such transmission. Regional administrators report increasing difficulties managing populations that appear compliant but maintain underground networks of cultural preservation. The correspondence includes recommendations for addressing these problems through even more intensive surveillance and control measures. But the proposed solutions require resources that strain the empire's administrative capacity, revealing system weaknesses that may eventually prove fatal to imperial power. Late at night, when guards assume you're sleeping, you join other women in sharing fragments of the cultures the Mongols tried to destroy. Persian mathematical concepts, Arabic astronomical observations, Chinese philosophical traditions, and Turkic musical forms all survive in memory networks that operate beneath the surface of apparent submission. These cultural exchanges create something the Mongols never intended: the hybrid identities that incorporate knowledge from across their conquered territories. You're no longer just Agarim from Samarkand, but part of a new community forged through shared trauma and mutual survival, carrying forward traditions from civilizations that officially no longer exist. The realization comes gradually. The Mongols may have conquered your body and controlled your immediate circumstances, but they've also inadvertently created something they can't control: networks of cultural resistance that span continents and may outlast the political structures designed to eliminate them. 2 years have passed since Samarkand fell, and you've survived what killed 67% of the women who arrived with you. But survival came at costs. You're still calculating in the quiet moments between mandatory exercises and administrative duties. Your body bears modifications that the Mongol medical system classifies as successful adaptations: scars from systematic violence, nutritional changes from controlled diets, and the physical aftermath of pregnancies designed to produce children for an empire rather than families. The compound now houses your 18-month-old son Temur, named by Mongol administrators rather than chosen by you. He represents everything designed to destroy your previous identity. Born from violence that imperial law defines as legitimate reproduction, raised in facilities that systematically eliminate maternal bonds, and destined for military training that will transform him into an instrument of the same system that created him through systematic brutality. You love him with an intensity that surprises you, despite understanding that this emotional attachment serves Mongol administrative purposes. The empire has learned that mothers who genuinely care for their mixed-blood children become more invested in imperial success, less likely to attempt escape or suicide, and more willing to cooperate with procedures designed to maximize reproductive efficiency. Wei Ling observes your interactions with Temur during the daily monitoring sessions, recording notes about maternal attachment levels, child development milestones, and the psychological techniques most effective for managing mother-child relationships within the breeding program. His reports contribute to administrative manuals used throughout the empire for optimizing human resource extraction. Your son shows excellent physical development. Wei Ling comments during a routine evaluation, measuring Temur's height and examining his muscle tone with the clinical attention applied to valuable livestock. His mixed heritage provides advantages for future military service: strong bone structure from the maternal line, aggressive temperament from the paternal line. The casual way he discusses your child's genetic characteristics while planning for his removal reveals how completely the system has normalized atrocities that would have been unthinkable in your previous life. Imperial administrators discuss stealing children from their mothers with the same bureaucratic tone they might use for crop rotation schedules or taxation policies. The separation will occur when Temur reaches age 5, following established procedures designed to eliminate maternal influence while preserving useful genetic material for future generations. Boys showing promise are inducted into Mongol military systems after careful evaluation, while girls are assessed for their potential contribution to breeding programs or domestic service facilities. The timing isn't accidental. Mongol researchers have determined that separation at age 5 maximizes military loyalty while minimizing psychological trauma that might interfere with training effectiveness. Children removed at this age retain enough early bonding to remain psychologically stable, but not enough cultural identity to develop conflicting loyalties as they mature. Recent arrivals at the compound bring intelligence that circulates through whispered conversations during work periods and exercise sessions. The fragments paint a picture of an empire experiencing internal pressures that weren't visible during the early conquest period. Succession disputes following Urgadai Khan's death have created power struggles that affect resource allocation and administrative priorities throughout the territories. Regional commanders are demanding increased quotas of trained soldiers to support competing claims to imperial succession. This pressure translates into accelerated timelines for separating children from their mothers, intensified training programs, and expanded recruitment from breeding facilities across the conquered territories. But the intelligence also reveals something more encouraging. The systematic approach to conquest that seemed so unstoppable during Samarkand's fall is creating problems that strain imperial resources and administrative capacity. An empire built on traumatizing conquered populations must continuously expand to maintain the terror that prevents rebellion, but expansion requires resources that exploitation alone cannot provide indefinitely. Revolts have broken out in previously pacified regions as populations that initially submitted to discover that compliance offers no protection from systematic brutality. Chinese territories report organized resistance movements that coordinate across provinces, sharing information about Mongol military weaknesses and administrative vulnerabilities. Persian cities that surrendered without fighting have begun experiencing mysterious incidents, poisoned water supplies in Mongol garrisons, sabotaged equipment, and accidents that claim the lives of administrative personnel. The incidents appear random, but follow patterns that suggest coordinated planning by networks that operate beneath the surface of apparent submission. Even more significantly, the empire's own mixed blood population is beginning to create unexpected problems. Children raised in Mongol military systems retain fragments of their mothers' cultures, despite systematic efforts to eliminate such transmission. Some develop loyalties that combine imperial service with subtle resistance, creating internal contradictions that threaten system effectiveness. A new arrival named Aisulu brings particularly valuable intelligence from the Western territories. She was captured during recent operations in Kiev and travelled through several administrative centres during transport to Karakorum. Her observations reveal an empire struggling to manage the consequences of its own systematic approach to conquest. The breeding compounds in Batu Khan's territory are operating at reduced capacity, she whispers during a nighttime conversation in the exercise courtyard. Mortality rates among captive women have increased beyond acceptable levels, and replacement captures aren't keeping pace with administrative demands for new children. The mathematical reality behind Mongol population management is becoming visible. Systematic trauma produces high mortality rates among captive breeding populations. Women subjected to continuous psychological and physical violence die faster than natural reproduction can replace them. creating resource shortages that require increasingly aggressive expansion to maintain population quotas. Meanwhile, the children produced through systematic breeding programs require enormous resources for training, feeding, and housing until they reach military age. The empire is discovering that industrialized human exploitation generates costs that may exceed the economic benefits extracted from conquered populations. These resource pressures are forcing uncomfortable choices between competing imperial priorities. Military commanders need more soldiers to maintain control over restive territories, but producing those soldiers requires maintaining breeding populations that consume resources needed for military operations. Your own situation begins to reflect these broader pressures during your third year in the compound. Wei Ling approaches you with an unusual proposition that suggests the empire's evolving needs. Your demonstrated survival skills, linguistic abilities, and experience with multiple cultural systems make you valuable for purposes beyond reproduction. The administrative bureau requires translators and cultural interpreters, he explains during a private meeting in his office. Conquered territories are becoming increasingly difficult to manage, and we need personnel who understand both imperial procedures and local customs. Your cooperation in this role would result in improved living conditions and delayed separation from your son. The offer represents a form of limited freedom assignment to administrative duties that would remove you from the breeding program while keeping you within Mongol control systems. It's not liberation, but survival with a degree of dignity that would have seemed impossible during your first months in captivity. More importantly, administrative work would provide access to information about the Empire's internal operations, including details about system vulnerabilities that might someday be exploited by resistance movements. The Mongols need cultural interpreters precisely because their systematic approach to conquest has created problems they don't fully understand. The position would involve traveling to newly conquered territories to assess local conditions, interview surviving populations, and provide recommendations for administrative policies that minimize rebellion while maximizing resource extraction. You would become part of the system that destroyed your original life, but also gain opportunities to influence how that system treats other conquered peoples. The moral complexity of the choice keeps you awake for several nights. Collaboration offers survival for yourself and delayed separation from Timor, but also makes you complicit in procedures that will traumatize other families the way yours was traumatized. Refusal means returning to the breeding program and losing your son according to the original schedule. Your decision comes after a conversation with Bibi, the Khwarezmian woman whose stories first revealed the scope of Mongol systematic brutality. She has survived longer than anyone else in the compound, developing insights that come only from extended observation of imperial operations. The Empire needs us now in ways they didn't need us before, she says during one of your whispered conversations. Their system is breaking down because they never understood the people they were trying to control. We can use their dependence on us to create small acts of mercy that might save lives, even if we can't stop the larger machinery. Her words crystallize something you've been sensing without fully understanding. The Mongol system that seemed so permanent and inescapable during the early conquest period is revealing vulnerabilities that suggest it may not last forever. The administrative positions they're offering to trusted prisoners represent both the Empire's growing weaknesses and opportunities for subtle resistance. You accept Wei Ling's offer, understanding that survival sometimes requires participating in systems you would prefer to destroy. The collaboration will provide opportunities to help other captive populations while preserving yourself and your son for a future that may offer better possibilities for meaningful resistance. 5 years after Samarkand's destruction, you stand in the administrative compound of a newly conquered Russian city, watching procedures you helped design being implemented with the bureaucratic efficiency that has become your specialty. Your position as cultural interpreter has taken you across half the known world, from Chinese cities to European fortresses, always arriving after the conquest to to help imperial administrators manage populations they don't understand. The work requires a form of psychological splitting that you've perfected over years of collaboration and survival. Part of you participates in systematic brutality with the professional competence that keeps you valuable to your captors. Another part preserves fragments of mercy within procedures designed to eliminate such possibilities, creating small spaces for human dignity within industrial systems of dehumanization. Your son Timur, now approaching his 6th birthday, has developed into exactly what Mongol planners intended, a child whose mixed heritage provides advantages for military service, while his systematic training eliminates cultural loyalties that might conflict with imperial purposes. He speaks Mongolian as his primary language, follows military routines with enthusiasm, and shows no obvious signs of remembering the Samarkand dialect you whispered to him during his earliest months. But beneath the surface compliance, you've managed to preserve fragments of your original culture, disguised as games and songs that Mongol supervisors dismiss as harmless maternal bonding. He knows Persian numbers embedded in counting rhymes, Arabic astronomical concepts presented as children's stories, and Chinese characters taught as drawing exercises. The transmission occurs during brief moments of contact that imperial schedules permit between mother and child. These interactions are monitored and recorded, but the observers lack sufficient cultural knowledge to recognize the significance of seemingly innocent activities. Your position as cultural interpreter provides credibility that deflects suspicion from your subtle resistance efforts. The irony isn't lost on you. The same linguistic skills that made you valuable to the empire also enable you to subvert its cultural elimination programs. Mongol administrators depend on your expertise to understand conquered populations, never realizing that this expertise includes techniques for preserving the cultures they're trying to destroy. Your current assignment involves developing administrative procedures for managing the populations of recently conquered territories in Eastern Europe. The work requires interviewing survivors, assessing their potential for resistance, and recommending policies that maximize resource extraction while minimizing the administrative costs of controlling rebellious populations. The recommendations you provide include subtle modifications that imperial administrators don't recognize as acts of mercy. Suggestions for slightly better food rations, marginally less crowded housing conditions, and administrative procedures that allow limited cultural practices to continue under imperial supervision. The changes seem insignificant individually, but collectively they create conditions that improve survival rates among captive populations. More importantly, your position provides access to intelligence about resistance movements throughout the empire. Your reports to imperial administrators include accurate information about immediate threats, but omit details about long-term organizational efforts that might eventually pose more serious challenges to Mongol control. The resistance networks you've observed operate with sophistication that suggests learning and adaptation over years of imperial occupation. Cultural preservation efforts have evolved from simple memory transmission to organized programs that maintain educational systems, religious practices, and technological knowledge across generations of apparent subjugation. These networks have learned to exploit the empire's administrative weaknesses, particularly the dependence on local collaborators who maintain emotional connections to their original cultures despite official conversion to imperial loyalty. The most effective resistance operations are conducted by people like yourself, trusted prisoners whose collaboration provides access to imperial systems, while their hidden loyalties enable subtle sabotage. During your travels, you've encountered other women who survived the systematic brutality of Mongol conquest and found ways to use their positions within imperial systems for purposes the empire never intended. A Chinese mathematician uses her administrative duties to maintain educational networks that preserve scientific knowledge. A Persian poet disguises cultural transmission as entertainment for imperial officials. A Turkic healer provides medical care that includes psychological support for maintaining cultural identity under occupation. These women represent something the Mongols never anticipated when they designed their systematic approach to conquest. The breeding programs intended to create loyal servants for the empire have instead produced a generation of people whose mixed heritage provides access to imperial systems, while their maternal cultural transmission creates complex loyalties that transcend simple obedience. Your own son exemplifies these contradictions. His military training has made him an effective young warrior who follows orders without question, but the cultural knowledge you've transmitted through disguised games has given him perspectives that extend beyond imperial loyalty. He may serve the empire that created him, but he also carries forward fragments of the civilization it tried to destroy. The realization that has taken years to fully understand is becoming clear. The Mongol approach to conquered populations contains fatal contradictions that may eventually undermine imperial stability. An empire built on systematic trauma requires continuous expansion to maintain the terror that prevents rebellion, but expansion beyond a certain point becomes logistically impossible, while the accumulated trauma creates ever-increasing populations of hidden enemies. The children born in breeding compounds carry cultural memories their fathers never intended them to inherit. The administrative systems designed to eliminate cultural transmission have instead created new forms of cultural preservation that operate beneath the surface of apparent compliance. The imperial dependence on local collaborators has created internal networks that maintain loyalties the empire can't control or fully understand. Recent intelligence suggests that these contradictions are beginning to manifest as serious threats to imperial stability. Succession disputes following Munka Khan's death have created opportunities for regional resistance movements to coordinate their activities across previously isolated territories. The empire's own mixed blood populations are beginning to develop loyalties that combine imperial service with subtle resistance. Your position provides a unique perspective on these developments because your work requires regular contact with resistance networks that imperial administrators can't identify. The cultural knowledge that makes you valuable as an interpreter also enables you to recognize organized resistance efforts that operate in languages and cultural frameworks that Mongol officials can't decode. The networks you've observed are preparing for opportunities that may arise from internal imperial conflicts. Years of systematic oppression have created populations with nothing left to lose, while the empire's administrative dependence on cultural collaborators has created systems that can be turned against their intended purposes by people with appropriate knowledge and access. The final realization comes during your assignment to assess conditions in recently conquered Hungarian territories. The systematic procedures that seemed so unstoppable during Samarkand's fall are now being implemented by an empire that has overextended its resources and administrative capacity. The terror that once made resistance seem impossible is being undermined by the empire's own contradictions and the accumulated wisdom of populations that have learned to adapt and survive under systematic oppression. You understand now that your survival and collaboration have served purposes beyond personal preservation. The cultural knowledge you've maintained and transmitted, the mercy you've embedded within brutal procedures, and the intelligence you've gathered about resistance networks all contribute to possibilities that extend beyond your individual lifetime. The Mongol Empire will eventually fragment and decline, brought down by the same systematic approaches that initially made it seem invincible. But the cultural networks preserved through hidden transmission, the hybrid identities created through systematic breeding programs, and the resistance strategies developed under imperial occupation will survive to help reconstruct the civilizations that officially no longer exist. Your son will grow up to serve an empire that created him through systematic violence, but he will also carry forward fragments of cultures that empire tried to eliminate. His children and grandchildren will inherit both imperial training and cultural knowledge that transcends imperial boundaries, creating possibilities for synthesis and reconstruction that the empire's founders never imagined. In the end, the Mongol systematic approach to conquered women reveals fundamental truths about human resilience that remain constant across historical periods. Identity can be controlled, and cultures can be suppressed, but they can rarely be eliminated entirely. The psychological techniques designed to break resistance often create new forms of cultural preservation that operate below the surface of apparent compliance. The archives remain in libraries across Beijing, Istanbul, and Moscow administrative records that document systematic atrocities with the same bureaucratic precision applied to any other imperial enterprise. These documents preserve evidence of industrial-scale dehumanization that operated for over a century, but they also document resistance strategies and cultural preservation techniques that enabled survival under conditions designed to eliminate such possibilities. The women who survived Mongol conquest created networks of cultural transmission that influenced entire civilizations for generations after imperial power declined. Their strategies for preserving identity under systematic oppression, maintaining human dignity within dehumanizing systems, and using collaboration as a cover for subtle resistance continue to provide insights relevant to contemporary struggles against systematic injustice and cultural elimination.